best operators in the world? No. Which is what I call strategic inefficiency, which is just basically like you build a sixth sense about when you don't need to care about something because it's going to break 5 times anyway before you begin to fix it. So I think of it almost as levels, like level 1, 2, and 3. The third level of thinking is strategic inefficiencies. Like when you get to that point where you can effectively take on debt in smart ways to achieve your goals. The problem is a 23-year-old founder or 26-year-old founder does not know the difference. This is the first time they're doing it. So they see their idols, they see the people they read about or they read the podcasts about, and they're like, oh, I listened to that podcast about that great CTO who talked about like strategically taking on debt. That's okay. See, the world, you can trade off quality and speed. You see, someone from Booble company did it or whatever, some great company. I'm going to do that because I read about it in a book from Paul Graham, or I read about it. And then what happens is they make a mess of it because that's an advanced skill. Often the people who get in the most trouble in tech are really smart people without experience.
Get ready for the Product Tea with Leah, your fun-sized dose of business, tech, growth, and product chatter. I'm your host, Leah, and it's time to spill the tea. Good morning, everyone. He is basically the Sherlock Holmes of the tech world, solving complex problems and answering the why with a magnifying glass in one hand and a pile of qualitative and quantitative data in the other. Please give a chaotic welcome to the man, the myth, the legend, my friend, and the only guest who has been here already as the very first one of the entire podcast, and the only guest whose Twitter handle sounds like a sushi roll, John Cutler. How are you doing this morning?
Pretty good. How are you doing?
I'm doing absolutely fantastic. So, how would you rate this introduction from 1 to 12 samurai?
Would I recommend it to a friend?
Careful.
On a scale of 1 to 12, that's suitably weird. Not 11 options. Well, probably a 7, 8, a 9. Maybe I would recommend. How about a 10? Okay, I'll recommend. No. How about I'll recommend it to a friend with an 11?
Thank you for tuning in. This was the shortest episode we ever recorded. John, it is so great to see you. I have not seen you in like a million years. And This is always a good excuse to actually get you on camera. So can you introduce yourself to the fools that may not know you?
Sure. Yeah. John Cutler. I work as a senior director of product enablement at a company called Toast, and I have a background in B2B SaaS, companies like Pendo, Zendesk, Amplitude, Appfolio. Then I had a prior life before that as a musician and then doing other tech things. Yeah, that's about it. Product manager and then UX researcher. And now, the whole company is my product now at the moment. So yeah, it's fun. That's me.
The entire company.
Well, not like, a large group of humans doing product. That's how I think about it, at least.
Yeah, well, that's really cool. Is there something that people get wrong about you once they get to know you?
Well, I think that a lot of people probably from my writing, depending which post or which article they step in on, they probably think, they probably imagine like tons of analysis paralysis because they see me analyzing something from a bunch of different angles. But I don't know, at work in the day-to-day, I'm pretty, let's go. Let's get it done.
Yeah, I can confirm that.
Yeah. So I think another way to put it is I'm extremely pessimistic and optimistic at the same time. So they might just assume I'm either just pessimistic or they might assume, well, I don't know, he seems like utopian or something. So depending on which post, you'll either imagine that I'm super pessimistic about whether companies can operate correctly, or you'll think I'm super optimistic, he thinks that there's always a way to work out the problem. Actually, I'm kind of both in the day-to-day. So I assume almost everything will fail a couple times, but I'm really optimistic about that. Like, how optimistic is it to know that it's probably going to work out? It's probably going to work out after a couple tries. So I'm both of those things. And sometimes people maybe get that a little wrong too.
Yeah, I think that's a fairly good summarization of yourself. I think you're one of the few people that I know that can hold two thoughts at the same time in their head, or 12.
And they debate each other simultaneously out in public.
Before they even come out of the mouth. Yeah, no. I feel like you have always been a very brilliant systems thinker that is not caring so much like what kind of opinions did you hold, but you love battling them out. And I
Yep.
think that's been always a very, I think that maybe this is the reason why we get along. Also, you're the only person who can interrupt me.
What?
I don't know. What?
Right? What did you say? I
Thing?
don't agree with that.
That's all
There-
good. All right. Is there something, are there any problems in the product world that we have nowadays, John, either in your current job or anything else that we could talk about? Is there anything, like, even if you have to think long and hard, it's just like something really minor, anything? Is there something that you would like to talk about?
Well, I mean, I think I can't talk about specifics, but I can definitely, I'm deep in the product operations world, you could say. Although I sometimes don't think product operations is an actual thing. But yeah, I'll fight with Melissa about that. But like, yeah, I mean, I can talk about that. I also, my title is enablement, so people often ask me questions about what's the difference between enablement and operations, those types of
Hmm.
things. And yeah, I think that that's an area I'd love to talk with people about if they're interested about, or if you're interested about it.
Sure. Like, I think in general, the things that I love talking with you about is the realities of being efficient at scale.
Yeah,
Because
efficiency.
once because what because that's what an organization is, right? Like, we're growing,
Yep.
we're getting bigger, there's more problems, there's more people, there's more sensibilities to take care of. And for some reason, shit just tends to break on very basic levels at the same time, just at scale. And the most simple things start to become really, really difficult. I don't know, like, is that something that you see? I mean, I know that you're seeing it because I also read your newsletter occasionally, but like, are there some things that are specifically annoying to you, or where you just like,
Annoying.
I wish my life was easier in
You're
that
trying to
regard?
get hot takes out of me now to do these things.
Yeah, I am.
Well, I mean, I think that one thing that comes to mind, well, first of all, is just the word efficiency.
Hmm.
And this is an interesting thing because especially with the economy where it's at, that word and productivity and other things like that get thrown around a lot
Hmm.
lately. And it gets thrown around at our company and it gets thrown around at pretty much everyone I'm talking to out there now. At some point, someone has said, are we running as efficiently as possible? Or are we productive as possible? And then, so some of the things that I talk to people about, especially on a day to day basis, is that what does efficiency mean or even look like to you? So now you'd think this is a very, very straightforward question. But, so for example, you can have a car that's highly efficient and gets great miles per gallon, but you drive it off a cliff into the water. So you can efficiently drive your car off the cliff into the water. So one way of efficiency is to talk about, is the machine working? Is the machine itself working efficiently? So you've got these things. And then, though, if you layer in the idea of capital efficiency, and so capital efficiency is basically the efficiency with which you use capital, human capital, and other forms of capital to achieve particular strategic goals and mid to long
No.
term goals. And when you take that particular perspective, it almost by definition has a mid to long term implication, right? Because you're using capital to achieve these goals. And then it takes on a whole other different life in the particular conversation. So, one thing that you also realize is that depending on the background in business people have, so if someone's from like a sales team or if someone's from a finance team or use the word efficiency, they probably are not referring to capital efficiency. They're probably referring to a kind of more near-term efficiency. Literally, how much work can we do with the number of people? Like, how low can we keep certain dollar values to achieve the near-term effect that you're doing? And so that's one thing that has been fascinating me a lot lately is just how we even throw around these words. The same thing with productivity. You can have a factory that's highly productive, but it's producing shit. And unless you're buying shit, it's not very effective factory to be able to do those things. So I think that those are some of the things a lot on my mind. And remember also when I'm talking about this, obviously I have my own day job, but also I having a bunch of conversations with people out in the
Hmm.
world from different companies. And it's just amazing how common these discussions are between companies, probably because the macroeconomic situation at the moment. So those are some things that have been fascinating me lately. I don't know, like when you hear the words efficiency or productivity or any of these types of things, what comes to your mind? But those are some things on my mind.
I have a treasure trove of opinions on this. So let's just go with it. Okay, so efficiency. First of all, the first time that I talked about efficiency, I can remember this. It's very specifically is when we talked about the efficiency of a scaling company.
Mm.
And one thing that always happens is when you think about efficiency in the classical definition of the word, so like doing something with the most efficient motion of, so like
Yeah.
you want to create like as little power input as possible with the biggest kind of effect. Efficiency is the number one enemy of innovation. And I absolutely love this because when I was researching my talk back then, was one of my bigger talks that I had. I was coming across this. I never remember now the name, but like in the industrial times, like when they started to become efficient in terms of, like industrialization. So the story goes something like this. You have a watchmaker that is producing watches, which is something that people want. And then someone has the glorious idea like, hey, why do we not take apart the process of creating a watch into many, many, many little sub steps? And instead of like having 9 master clock makers, we just have 9 peasants who are much cheaper, much faster because they take care of like one little individual process step in there. And it's true. You become much more efficient. You also become much more miserable because your people don't get paid a lot of money anymore. A lot of knowledge is wasted. But you could say that, well, it makes sense. We don't need to have master clock makers everywhere. Right. So, like, then you have this kind of thing. But the problem is, if the world ever wants a different kind of watch, all these people who are unskilled, who are not motivated, they will leave you in a second and they don't know what to do with it either. So, this is why this pull between efficiency and innovation is extremely hard. And I think it's also the underlying fundamental theory of business why bigger companies struggle to be innovative at scale, because it's almost impossible unless you have structures that really separate entities inside of a company. For instance, you make a team very, very independent and you say, like, okay, you're going to get a budget, but you don't have to play the games that we play,
Yeah.
just like HubSpot did. And I think that's probably my first takeaway. So I'm going to pause here for a second, but I think that's how I look at efficiency versus innovation. It is the biggest enemy of what I love most, which is innovation, which is funny because I'm also a growth advisor who talks a lot about efficiency. So it's like it's a constant pull.
Well, I also think that you can innovate efficiently, theoretically. Like, so if
That's
it
true.
really depends on the goal of the system, right? So if you have a system that you want to create a lot of innovation from, there's certainly more efficient and less efficient ways to do that. And in fact, more efficiency and innovation to most people looks kind of crazy. Look at those crazy people doing what they're doing. And oh my God, they never hit their deadlines. And like, oh, those wacky people in the innovation lab to do these things. But I think one thing that's interesting is how organizations are very symbiotic with this, in the sense that, for example, you don't want a team that's focusing on doing something really new having to rethink how to do product analytics, having to rethink where they're going to deploy stuff, having to rethink how they're going to do HR. I mean, actually, HR, you'd probably want them to rethink how they're going to do HR. But there's other, you wouldn't want them to have to do different systems or different things within the company. So I think that when you think of organizations, people tend to typecast an organization and say, it's in a growth phase or it's a scale phase or it's all those types of things. Realistically, is sort of a portfolio of motions going on at once. And you notice this at the scale, for example, that I work at and operate right now, that it's very, very difficult to apply one way. So in fact, one thing that we think a lot about, and I think about, is in product operations enablement, when I do, is literally the exploration of the benefits and the risks of consistency every day. That's basically my job. And what I mean by that is to say, I have to think very, very artfully about what needs to remain consistent across 1,500 people at scale to do those things. And what you notice is that people with like a traditional business background automatically make economies of scale assumptions about what could be remain consistent. So they'll look at a group and they'll say, well, I mean, geez, if all of those teams need this, then obviously we need some kind of centralized service for it and everything needs to be consistent. And wouldn't it be great if everyone used Jira the same way? And wouldn't it be great if we had document templates? And so a lot of my job is actually to say, no, it wouldn't be great if that was the same way.
No.
In fact, it's the lightest amount of consistency you need to get things going in the same direction. And so I think that that's a very interesting thing to me. The one thing that also jumps out is that you could have operations folks or people doing this kind of stuff at different parts of your company. And the philosophy needs to be different depending on whether you're in sales or marketing operations or you're in product or your product operations, is that the ideas around operations remain similar, the core principles remain similar, but how they play out in the different groups has to be very, very different. So I think that that's, just building off of your particular idea. It's sort of at scale, you're always doing many motions, typically at once. And also, you're always having to make decisions about what has to be consistent or not consistent across the teams to be able to function correctly. So to give like a specific example, this is really funny and I can talk about it, is like any company, we have projects sometimes that are big and have many dependencies or whatever. And so this is going to be the funniest admission from John Cutler, who wrote the 12 Signs You're Working in the Feature Factory post. But I saw that and I said, it's important we name it to tame it. So my single biggest innovation so far at my job is the word big messy projects, BMPs. And I literally said, look, when you've got something that has a lot of dependencies across the thing, we all need to have one word for it, because that's the type of thing that almost by definition is going to involve lots of people. In fact, we need to name it to tame it. And these are things that we do need to work consistently on. So I gave it a funny name, big messy project. And my boss was joking that for the feature factory guy, for the one innovation at their current job is to name the big messy projects, basically the ultimate feature factory things that they're doing, is kind of ironic. But anyway, here we are.
I really, really like this. So about 4 notes on this. So the first one is, did you come up with this phrase, name it to tame it? Or like
No,
name it?
I know. I mean, that's as long as I can remember it. But yeah, that's
Yeah,
it's
okay, good.
like a good saying in the United States. Like
It's
I don't
clever.
know
It's
where I
really
heard it.
clever. It could have been you though, because it's really clever. So, but I don't know it
Yeah,
because I'm not an English
it's my
native.
spirit animal. Like if I was John GPT, I would have regurgitated "Name it to tame it."
All right. So I think there are 2 fundamental problems in any organization. And that, by the way, goes like, and in an organization, I mean, like even down to the very smallest unit of an organization, which is a team. And I think there's 2 fundamental problems that we still not have solved, which are the easiest levers for me to pull in any strategic advising when I go into companies and tell them what they do wrong and get paid for it, which is the best part of my job. So the first one is, it is very easy to implement processes, but it's very hard to get rid of them or like to reevaluate them, like to have a process to reevaluate the processes,
Yeah.
which is actually the only process that you actually need in a company. So, what do I mean with that? So, let's assume John spills his coffee in the morning over the keyboard, and because of this, we transfer all our money to JP Morgan and we never get it back. I don't know, like just some funny example. So, we now have an office policy to never drink coffee in front of Leia's PC. So, this might make a lot of sense in the first 2 weeks, but then at some point, it's becoming a thing. Nobody even knows why it is there. At some point, everybody who has originally worked at the company when this was necessary is not even there anymore, but the rule stays, right? Like these processes, they have a really nasty habit of staying, along with some Scrum processes, which, I always love to hate on a regular basis. The other thing is, I'm calling this now the woo-woo effect of meetings, or like certain processes. There are processes in your company, and quite a lot of them actually, that don't do anything. They're not in itself harmful, but they're also not giving you any gain that you think they are. For instance, like, hey, everybody has to use the same project management tool, or, which is not necessarily a process, but like, let's call it an edict. But they do harm you regardless, not because of what they do, but because they prevent you from doing something else. They
Yeah.
cost you time, they cost you mental energy, and also they occupy you there. And because you think you took care of something, you're not considering it in the future when you do have a bigger organizational problem to think, oh, this could be the problem. No, because we dealt with it already. And a good example is bad tooling for user discovery or how to
Yeah.
store user feedback, whatever it is, right? Like qualitative, quantitative analysis. Well, are you good at data? Yeah, we're using Mixpanel, or yeah, we're using Amplitude. That was not my question. The question is, how good are you? Yeah, we have a
Yeah.
data tool. That's not what I mean. And yeah, that's a very common thing that happens all the time.
Yeah. I mean, I think I think the hardest part in the business actually is that I wrote about this recently, but it really has been sticking in my mind that normal growing pains at rapid scale
Mhm.
look almost exactly the same in a company that has core, I just call it core efficiency. And what I don't care too much about the word efficiency with that. What I just basically mean is core resilience, in
No.
effect, like core resilience as the company. And so I think that for a lot of people, you get into this difficult situation where at rapid scale, everything is breaking all the time. In fact, if it wasn't breaking, you probably wouldn't be growing. And if there wasn't chaos, some bit of chaos, you probably wouldn't be growing. You probably wouldn't be doing that. And I can remind this, my kid is like 5, and you can see when he grows a little bit, he's like, his body doesn't move correctly. It's a little out of whack because his legs are too long,
Yeah.
or his hands are too big or whatever. And those are growing pains. Like, that's the actual definition of growing pains. The challenge is that growing pains looks almost exactly the same between a company that is thinking about its core resilience and a company that isn't. So the challenge that you have for a lot of like successful business people or successful people with their companies or their startups or their whatever, especially if they haven't had a high end of companies, like hundreds of companies and seen them, is they have not built the sixth sense to know the difference between when normal growing pains and when they're digging a hole for themselves that they're not going to be able to get out. And I would actually think that there's even a higher level art that the best operators in the world know, which is what I call strategic inefficiency, which is just basically like you build a sixth sense about when you don't need to care about something because it's going to break 5 times anyway before you begin to fix it. So I think of it almost as levels, like level 1, 2, and 3. Very simple for John. I've never talked like this anyway, but you've got me in the morning. Like level 1 is basically, oh my God, we trade off scale and efficiency. Well, okay, that makes sense. Like most people are at that level. The second level of thinking is basically, oh, there's core efficiency and growing pains. We need to take care of both. Otherwise, we'll get in trouble. The third level of thinking is strategic inefficiency. It's like when you get to that point where you can effectively take on debt in smart ways to achieve your goals. The problem is a 23-year-old founder or 26-year-old founder does not know the difference. This is the first time they're doing it. So they see their idols, they see the people they read about or they read the podcasts about, and they're like, oh, I listened to that podcast about that great CTO who talked about like strategically taking on debt. That's okay. See, the world, you can trade off quality and speed. You see, someone from Booble Company did it or whatever, some great company. I'm going to do that because I read about it in a book from Paul Graham, or I read about it. And then what happens is they make a mess of it. Because that's an advanced skill. And this is something I've been thinking a lot about lately, where often the people who get in the most trouble in tech are really smart people without experience. They're able to look at companies and read books and take in the principles. In their mind, there's just these first principles. But there's a difference between understanding first principles and actually seeing things play out as they work. And so I think, anyway, it's a little bit of a sidetrack from what we're talking about, but these things are nuanced. And then also, if you don't really understand the nuance or you haven't seen it play out a bunch of times, you can get yourself into a lot of trouble.
That is very true. And I have to say that smack dab, I am exactly this particular person that you just mentioned. About, I would say 10 to 15 years ago, I was reading books, I was getting my head into things, and then I tried to kind of acquire a minimum kind of knowledge to appear experienced, because for some reason we really love to appear experienced, right? Like everybody loves to just be like, I'm the best in the world about anything. And I think a funny metaphor or like comparison or whatever it is to really think about this is like professional sports. There is not a single person in the world that read a book, did not train practically to understand what's going on with bodies, and how you have to compete, and was good at anything. Not a single person ever. And I think one of the problems is that, again, like we love to just be respected for what we appear to know, which is kind of funny because there's nothing wrong with being a beginner. And I think the other thing is that we still are fundamentally flawed in attributing what leads to something else. So, for instance, we always think that a very simple reason must be that particular thing. Oh, because John was shaving his hair, that's the reason why the company's doing so well, right? Like we love these simple stories. It's like, Bowser has captured the princess and now Mario is going to save it. And the entire story that unfolds around this is around these two kind of facts. And this is very, very detrimental. I was talking about this with Jason Fried, funny enough, in my last episode. And he was just like, don't overcomplicate it. Just don't
Mm.
overcomplicate it. It's really not that complicated. But what we mean with that is it's not that single reasons have big outcomes. It's just like if you try to tackle challenges, don't overcomplicate it
Yeah.
because there's not a single process that is overly complicated that works. Not a
Mhm.
single one, with the exception of maybe risk management in airspace travel.
One thing I would caution people about with that statement, though, is experts will always tell you that it's easy as one, two, three, because they've internalized the fact that it's not one, two, three. They've internalized all the tacit knowledge involved in one, two, three. So this is the thing. This is my rant against everything I see on LinkedIn lately. Is that people are like it's just that simple. It's just one, two, three. Like now, what they're basically saying is now it would be different if the statement was, "You are a beginner at this. You do not need to worry about the advanced parts of this. It is as simple as one, two, and three." Because then you're at least putting a footnote or you're putting a warning label on the advice you're giving and saying, by the way, you're trying to learn this and this is a good model. This is a model that you will get. And then you're going to throw away this framework because you're going to get into the deeper level of understanding it. But they don't say that. So people will say it's as easy as one, two, three. Now, when I look at that, I can assume one of two things. One, they are not very experienced because they think it's one, two, three, or they are a teacher at heart and they've just
Yeah.
forgot to put the footnote. They know in their heart, like, okay, there's more to this and there's a lot of tacit knowledge and there's a lot of things connected to it. I just don't need to put, I'm too busy using Miro and ChatGPT to put a little footnote that says, throw away this framework once you get good at this thing. So that's kind of the thing that I've noticed is that like none of this work is simple. However, the way we talk about it can be very simple. And also to make progress in anything, you can't take the
I was about to say
complexity
that.
of the whole
Yeah.
world. You can't take the complexity of the whole world on your shoulders when you do things. And the way that you can see this too is ask any expert at their craft to one, give me a simple breakdown. I'll give you an example. I live in wine country in middle of near something in Santa Barbara, so Southern California. Now, amazing thing of my life, probably the coolest as someone who's a nerd about this, the best hour of my life. We were sitting next to two wine nerds, like actual winemakers. And they were talking about the crop this year and everything that was going on, all the pH values, all the intricacies of their art.
Mm.
And then the person's friend comes in and they're new to wine. And they're just like, oh, I see I found the nerds talking about the thing. And they explain to that person a very basic concept of wine using primary colors. They're
Mm.
like, I don't know the exact details, I forget, but there was just like, well, wine is air and the soil and the thing. It's like your primary colors and you mix it together. And this was how you get wine. And it was the most amazing thing because for 1 hour, I heard experts talk like experts talk when they're talking together, all the details and all the intricacies in the art. Yet when they had to explain it to me, they went all LinkedIn. They went, hey, everyone, do you know that wine is like primary colors? It's like red, green, blue, whatever. You mix them together and then you get the wine. So I don't know. I'm just noting that this is also kind of goes to the basis of expertise in general, which I find it very interesting.
I think I want to pull on this thread a little bit because I felt like I had this big frustration. I'm not sure whether you remember. Maybe I told you even as well. Like I had a lot of people, and you probably as well, who are asking you like, "So hey, how did you do this on LinkedIn? Like how did you grow
Yeah.
with that many followers? How do you write every day? How do you do this and that?" And I spent a lot of time with mentees and people because I have this inherent problem that I always try to fix someone's things, right? So like I'm very
Mm,
accessible. I'm very way too generous with my time. I know this, but that's just who I am. Anyways, so they asked me for like, so how did you do this? And initially, I would say like in the first year, I was always resorting to these frameworks because we love them, right? Like we love frameworks. Like, hey,
yeah.
like you have to post within not within more than once in 4 hours. You have to engage with the comments in the first 30 minutes. Then you should you have a hook like this and like that. And then whenever kind of, if I look back on who was actually, because my advice was top, right? I'm one of
Mm,
these expert winemakers. I know how this game works, at least to some degree, or more than 99% of the people on LinkedIn. So I know for sure that my advice works. Pretty confident about that. Why is it that most people who asked me about this stuff did not manage to pull off the same?
mm,
And it could be that I'm wrong about my advice again, right? So, like, we have this particular problem. or they were not serious about it. And I assume both of these are not the case. The problem is what they were asking me, and what they also don't realize is, how do you learn to be consistent? Because
Mm,
anything in life, no matter what you tell me about team management, how to get my calendar in under control, how do I make a company efficient or whatever, has always to do with the same topic, and it is about consistency. And I wanted to actually bounce this off of you because I was thinking about this relatively recently. You remember how when you plan a project, you have quality and then you have effort, and you have all these kind of these three pillars. I know we've talked
mhm,
about this as well. I think in my ADHD brain, you have three pillars, and one of them is consistency. So you can do something consistent. You can do it intense. So
mhm,
what you do is you just do it like very, very intense. Or you can also have quality. If you
mhm,
have all these three maximized, then you have the ideal thing. But you can only have one thing. If you say, like, I want to have this one thing, then you have to decrease the other two to have a bigger chance of getting that one thing that is non negotiable.
mhm,
And to me, it's always about consistency. So, for instance, the question is not, how did I have a couple of viral posts or whatever? The question is, how did Leah manage, as someone that is as all over the place as me, to post every day for 300 days, at least once on LinkedIn? That's a completely different question because
mhm.
no framework will help you with this. The frameworks
Yep.
teach you how to be more qualitatively better, more efficient. Here we go again, right? Like with the
Yep.
time, but they do not tell you how to establish an actual habit. And I feel like the biggest problem that people have is that they want too much, because consistency is about whether you spend 5 minutes or whatever it is every day for a specific amount of time. Doesn't matter whether you spend 30 minutes or 5 minutes or 20 minutes. It's about whether
Yep.
you spend it. And people usually want too much. So they start to create habits out of things that are unrealistic. So, for instance,
Mm,
hey, sitting down every day for
yep.
30 minutes and writing an article is unrealistic for 99% of the people because they have kids or whatever it is. No, but that's what it is. So, why don't you just start with 5 minutes? The quality will suffer and the intensity will also suffer, but that's what it is, right? So, like, any framework that you have in management, any framework that you have in company growth and so forth, anything that you cannot do on a recurring basis is garbage,
Mm.
period.
Well, and one thing that brings up in my mind is that it's also the difference between like additive and subtractive change. So
Mm,
companies will, whatever, this month or this quarter or this year, they're going to do this new framework or they're going to do these things. And I kind of asked them, well, what frameworks are you letting go of?
yeah,
How are you going to make this time? Like how are you going to go through this loop? And actually, the one thing, what I love about what you just said is actually the difference also between principles and frameworks to do those things. That in the sense, like a principle would be like show up every day and do the thing.
yeah,
Now, is that easy when someone's less experienced? That's probably that's like decent advice because it's a principle. Like that
yeah,
principle can apply pretty much anywhere. Like if you show up or if you're a company and you make sure to subtract some change before you add the change, or if you do any number of things, those are principles that we can follow. And frameworks, often what I call are like scaffolds. They actually are purposely simplified. Like all models are wrong and some are useful. And frameworks, all frameworks are wrong. All frameworks are useful because frameworks are essentially models for things. And so when you get that particular vibe going on, one take on this is if you know it, if you just, hey, everyone, all frameworks are wrong and some are useful and just use them smartly, you should be okay. And people should be able to share whatever they want to do these things. The same thing with principles, right? When someone says, I'm going to share my principles on LinkedIn, show up every day, be consistent, or you need to subtract change before you add change. I think that to your point, this is anytime I see someone that says it's simple and it's been solved, I know that that's not the problem. So, for example, to your point, I love your point, which is I think it was Pressfield wrote this great book called like The War of Art instead of
mhm,
The Art of War. And it's called The War of Art. And it's about literally getting up every day and writing. And I
yeah,
love that in his text in that, he's a little bit like, you're wrestling with the beast of your soul. He's like, he gets really about into this particular thing, which also shows like the same thing with companies, all these, oh, we did OKRs this and OKRs that and blah, 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 blah. There's a reason why 90% of companies are failing at all these particular things, right? Because there's some kind of like just core muscle that they're still trying to grow, or some kind of cultural thing. So anyway, those are some things that come to mind with that. But I think that the other thing about consistency, which is funny, is it's also it in a corporate environment, people underestimate how crazy hard it is. And my job is basically getting people to do things that hopefully that will be beneficial to them in the long run, but not in the short term most of the time. Now, I try to make it things that will benefit them in the short term too, because you have to give them something. And so, I definitely, especially now that I'm kind of internal in a company, every day I'm kind of like, well, what's in it for them? What are you,
Mm.
I say it to the people that I'm working with or working with, what's in it for them? What are you taking away that allows them to even fit this in their head? Another thing I say is it's 6 months from now, you and I are talking about a either pre-mortem or post-mortem, whatever we want to call it. Like, this is worked out. What is an actually reasonable explanation to this? It probably will not be because, oh my God, everyone loved the doc template. And to your point, that no one ever said that 6 months from now. No one ever said that. However, when I did this BMP thing with big messy projects and name it to tame it, I had a good idea that, like, you know what, there's probably a 60, 70% chance this will fail. I did actually even write a couple one pagers before and sent them to some people, like, let me float this idea to you. But I knew it was somewhat feasible. I could imagine a world 6 months from now that if you let something catch fire, like a new word, and it taps into people's, anxiety about things and their goals and what they need to get out of it, they're going to be able to get these things particular done. So it's kind of interesting. I mean, contrasting this, when I was working in Amplitude, I was able to give a lot of ivory tower advice to people
Yeah.
about, they came to me basically. So once they are already coming to me, they were already sold on what the shit that I was putting out, right? But when you're in a company and you're working in these things, you don't have that luxury, right? And so, like, a lot of these, you just reminded me of a lot of challenges of change internally in a company, but people vastly overestimate inertia or underestimate inertia. They
Yeah.
underestimate what's in it for people. They underestimate the ability for systems to push back on anything that breaks the flow of the thing. So yeah, internal change is a lot. You just reminded me a lot of frameworks and change, but it just reminded me a lot of the challenges
Yep.
internally at scale are very, very different. And a lot of these things come up. I don't know how I got there, but anyway, it was fun.
No, that makes a lot of sense. But let's take something very specific. Let's take a very simple example, I think, that illustrates what you just said in a very beautiful way, I think. Let's say you don't know how to cook well. You know how to cook, right? Like, I can feed myself, I can also make pasta, whatever, but like, I'm not a great cook. And
Yeah.
someone comes around and says, like, oh, Leah, you're cooking so fucking nice, right? Like, this is really great. The fundamental thing, there's a couple of fundamental things that will not change, right? So, like, we are hungry a specific amount of time a day, no matter how good you cook. That does not change. But you
Yeah.
might actually increase the enjoyment that you're getting out of one meal. So, if I had a magic wand to kind of, which is a book in some way, right? So, like, hey, look, I learned with this particular book on how to cook.
Mm,
The process of learning how to cook is still fundamentally work. It is
yeah.
work. And that's the unbeautiful. I just invented a new word. It's called unbeautiful. It's ugly.
Unbeautiful.
That's the ugly truth, that it is fundamentally about work. And no matter whether my book is correct, or it's the best book to actually learn how to cook, it will get you probably farther than where you are right now. And the problem is, if people are spending way too much time in kind of figuring out which is the best book, or just thinking about whether they should start instead of actually starting,
Yeah.
because once you do start, you will notice whether the book is good or not, because you see whether you advance. And that's why I usually say, like, don't concern yourself too much, just get a starting point. Just
Yeah.
start somewhere so you can do something, but you need to reevaluate. There is not a single discovery framework that you can use as a PM that is going to get you to the end that is just perfect. Neither Teresa's. I love Teresa
Yeah.
Torres's framework on, like, like how to do product discovery. It's not a good fit for every company, but please just start with something so you know what works and what does not work.
Yeah.
And this is the same
And
for
and even
everything else
that,
that
which
you
is
have.
one thing that gets me about that too, is be very careful of methods that are designed for individual advancement and acquisition of skills and acquisition of capabilities and all those different things. Once you project those over groups of people, things are always going to take on a different life in those. And so one thing I've noticed is that is there's definitely this overlap of personal development, personal advancement. And you see people talking about like advance your career, advance what you can do, which
Yeah.
are things that you can control by yourself. Like you can show up and do these things. And then people try to apply that to the companies that they're at. And I remember it's very interesting. I remember I was talking to Nirial about this, and I was talking about, well, your book's a lot about individual habits. What about team habits? And I loved, actually, this is very interesting about Nirial. I really like this, is that he was like, that's absolutely, I didn't go there. I have to admit that any of the science or any of the things that I drew on to discuss anything in my book was limited to individuals, not groups of people, to be able to do these things. So the one thing that I think that you're bringing up in my mind is that, there's a lot of stuff around habits. There's a lot of stuff around building consistency. There's a lot of stuff. When you project that over any sizable number of people, you really then have to play an enhanced game around the people that you have, right? Whoops. Hey, cat. And so that's just one thing that came up when you said that, because I think that this happens a lot actually with founders and other people, so that they're very into the personal development thing. And so they'll say, goodness, I had the best I'm the individual growth hacker of the world. I woke up every day for my startup for 3 years and I put in the time. Therefore, all people need to just do is adopt all the habits I had, and then this company would be successful. If everyone just adopted my killer productivity hacking, everyone would be in good shape. And realistically, that's not true, because humans are different and humans have different emotions and people have different things that drive them. And they'll say, we just need to align incentives so that everyone cares about everything that I care about. Oh, founder, that's not going to work either.
Yeah, no. I think you got a point. Did I tell you about the experiment with the pigeons?
No, sounds funny.
There's a famous experiment with pigeons. So you have would you call an accumulation of pigeons? Like, I don't know, is it a school? I don't know. Whatever. Like English is weird.
Probably a word for it. Yeah, I bet there
Okay,
is.
so you have about 30 pigeons in a coop or whatever it is, right? I think it's
Yeah.
a coop, whatever. And there is a random mechanism that is distributing food. And this mechanism is very random, right? Like it's not tied to anything that the pigeons do. It's just a random generator of time. And then at some point, it just gives food. And the funny thing is that whatever the pigeons have been doing at the time when the food actually came out, it has a very high chance of them becoming a habit because they think it's actually connected. And if you keep doing something often enough, right? Like you keep doing it, then the chance that it actually coincides again with food is starting to increase. So, at some point, so there were pigeons that were lifting their left leg because they were cleaning themselves and then the food came. So they figured, oh, that's what it is now. Then they started to become really persistent and they started to lift their legs all the time. So food came again. So it started to develop a habit. And then it was absolutely sure in its primal brain that that must be the thing. Like if I lift my leg, then I'm going to get food. And I feel like we are oftentimes the same because we think again, it's like this connection between simple input and output. I wanted to touch on something that you said, which is tracking the habits of teams. We are doing this already in a different area of our lives or in business. And this is a big thing actually about product led sales. So, what we are trying to do is we're trying to analyze the behavior of an account. And the behavior of
Mm.
an account would be like, okay, we have 20 users, and these 20 users, they are using the product in so and so way. So I don't even care whether one individual in there is not using the product, as long as the majority does, or like the team gets value out of it. And I feel like this is another case of, while this is a relatively new thing, right? We also talk about account-based marketing,
Yep.
account-based tracking, all of these kind of things. We have, as product managers, the tools to really optimize our teams like products. And I don't mean this like treat people as just numbers or whatever. I really talk about analyze in your team, use metrics, and if you don't have quantitative data, then you can still ask how people feel about things on a regular basis to improve how your team runs and does things. And this is how I always led my teams as well. And I hope also to great effect. I gave them a lot of freedom as long as I knew that they're treating their own teams as products. Whatever works. And if I feel like you take care of it, right? Like you really take care of the people, you ask them, hey, what did go well this week or what did not? And I don't mean like a retro in terms of like engineering or like, we could not get 55 points out instead of 42 or whatever. I'm really talking about the fundamental processes of, yes, we feel like we were successful. Yes, we understand what the strategy of the company is, and we also contributed to it. That is a fundamentally simple principle that is relatively hard to pull off. And that's usually also what, yeah. It's just not that fancy on LinkedIn, of course. It's also boring, right? Like, because you cannot really write about it. Treat your team like a product.
Yeah, it's also, I mean, sounds pretty 1984 too. Like it
Oh,
sounds like, oh,
wow.
I'm gonna treat them as a product. But I
Yeah,
do
yeah.
think, especially, at any company at scale, what tends to happen is the information asymmetries become so great. And so I even think this about, engagement surveys and other things like that. That's another good example. It's very hard for people to process that the qualitative data you're getting in some kind of engagement survey is going to have so many biases mixed in. There's a
Mm,
survivor's bias. There's also people stop talking about things that are bothering them. There's also people sort of come to grips with the reality of the company. And so therefore they don't give this particular thing. And you just reminded me of that thinking about qualitative data is that, I mean, I think the challenge at scale is, I'm just thinking about like the founder or people in our company, they're not going to be able to go and talk to 1,500 people. Like if they did that every single day, it'd be difficult. Even this like open door policy, like, okay, then you're going to get the people who select themselves to walk into the particular door. And so I think that the one thing that you realize at scale, centered around what you're talking about, is that those core frontline manager skills of not believing the world is built exactly like you think it's built. Don't assume that you know how to incentivize everyone in the world. Connecting with people on a deep level to be able to understand their particular needs. And are you helping them along their particular journey? Basics of human psychology, like they're going to stop telling you about things when they think that you're not going to do anything about it anymore. Right?
yeah.
So it's amazing, when you support a lot of managers, you start to see that like, it's really, really hard. It's actually a difficult thing to do, but also you start to see that just I don't mean basics in a bad way for what you were saying, but I mean like the ability to connect with your team and the ability to reach out and connect and ask people, what's going on and how are you doing those things are so often overlooked to
Yeah.
do that. And the reason why I mentioned the scale of the company is any idea that you can understand the whole nature or engagement or zeitgeist of a whole group of people through either surveys or anything like that, or even like, looking at their metrics in a lot of ways is very suspect to be able to do that thing. So yeah, I don't know. I'm just thinking about, we teach different some effective management courses and things like that, but a lot of it centers around kind of what you're talking about, which seems very basic to a lot of people, but is so often missed, I think.
So I use a specific principle, at least in my way, in that, let's say you want to develop a product and you're not sure which feature you should prioritize first. And I know you're familiar also with ODI or
Mhm.
like outcome driven innovation, where you just like facilitate quantitative and qualitative feedback. And I think I always use qualitative feedback from people to figure out what could be wrong.
Mm.
Right. So like I'm gonna ask you, like, say, so how was your day? And they say, this was annoying, right? So like now I have a new anchor that could be the problem for other people as well. So this is
Yeah.
how I kind of gather my list with qualitative feedback, but I'm not using qualitative feedback to kind of extrapolate how everybody feels because, as you said, this does not make a lot of sense. So how do you now utilize this as a good people leader in a team that is relatively small, because you do not have 200,000 people in your team that you
Yeah.
could quantifiably then verify whether John is actually unhappy today? So you don't have the quantitative data. And you should also not evaluate it qualitatively with a survey on like, hey, how do you feel about this from 1 to 5? But I think what the qualitative side gives you is areas to pay attention to as a person in one-on-one conversations. And then you have to rely on your own feeling.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, that's what it is. We also talked about this with Jason. A lot of the good decisions in business that I have made, I feel like at least, came from a gut reaction just because I felt a specific way. And you can 100% direct your attention towards something and then you try to try to figure out, so how do you feel about it afterwards, because you will never get the quantitative data to really make sure that it is a scientific decision. And I think That's okay. You know, that is really okay. But it takes time and it takes intent that you think about this, that you sit down and that you're not only talking to someone when you have this one on one slot every week for 45 minutes. It's about you sitting down when you don't have a meeting and you just think about, hey, what could be wrong for John right now?
Yeah.
He seemed worried, right? Like, and I'm not trying to interpret anything into the entire stuff, but like, this is the thing that you should do as a manager or as a leader in that sense. And it's far less process driven than people make it out to be to lead a company.
Well, I think another thing that comes up to my mind too is that a lot of leaders, there's a sort of, I call it leadership porn, basically. But in the leadership porn genre, there's a lot of stuff around leaders, going deep. Now I said that, now that's going to be really bad. Strike that last comment. But anyway, okay, so let's just get back on topic. But I'm just talking about like going deep, like getting into the details. You're going to have to get all the information about this particular situation. You're going to think. And I think that the one thing that advice misses is that when you try to get super, super specific on a problem, this is kind of a leader thing, you become also completely victim to all sorts of biases. You start to fall in love with your solution to that particular problem. You start to get fundamental attribution bias, right? You start to think like you desperately, as a leader, don't want systemic problems. So when you find one instance of a problem, you are biased to desperately want that to be the one problem. Right? You don't want to know that your company has trouble with engagement. You don't want to know that maybe, the psychological safety is low across the company, or there might be systemic reasons why that's happening. You desperately want that team you want to find that manager who's not doing their job. And that's why psychological safety is low. So the one thing that you reminded me of this is that on a manager level, when you're dealing with a group of people, at that point, you have no other choice. You're already deep, right? You're already with these people. And if anything, you're always circulating information. I think that the leader advice sometimes goes wrong, though, in the sense, I actually think it's important to go broad and then deep into a particular thing. The reason being that if you're not sampling a lot of sentiment from across the organization and understanding the system's nature of it, if you go immediately to there's a great book called Drift into Failure, which I believe everyone should read. It's really, really amazing. And in that book, it's called The Hunt for Broken Components and why that's wrong way to do it. But in the book that they talk about, I think his name is Fred Schlesinger is his name. Maybe I got the pronunciation wrong. But in that book, he talks about there's a danger in the hunt for broken components. When you go looking for broken components, you find broken components. You don't necessarily find the problem that you're dealing with. And so I think that this is like a fascinating thing, especially, I have to try to catch myself doing this at the scale that I'm working at. I have to advise other leaders to watch out for doing this thing because, they read the leadership porn, and the leadership porn, it's basically like you have to make sure that you go deep. When there's a problem, you have to get laser focused on that thing. However, I think counterintuitively, I believe that's the wrong advice. I think that you have to go broad first before you fall in love with that problem. And then you have to start creating a theory that could be a systems-based theory that unfortunately might span more than one team. And then you need to look at samples of that team. Another great example, I deal a lot with metrics of teams and a lot of surfacing metrics and, just simple things like I work with a list of teams and we look at roadmaps and we look at it. The selection bias problem is a huge problem, which is at 150 teams or 200 teams, you will ask people who are the teams that you've been looking at lately. And they'll list the same 10 to 15 teams across different leaders. And I'm like, that's curious. Why are they listing the same 10 to 15 teams? Why? Because a leader will look at one team and then the next meeting they have with another leader, they'll be like, have you thought about that particular team? What's going on there? Then that leader tells another leader. There's hundreds of other teams that have good things and bad things happening and have interesting stories and have great roadmaps and have great all those things. So another thing you notice at scale is you notice the selection bias, how problematic the selection bias problem is. And you'll either come up with a list of 10 problem teams, or you'll select biases like, well, why can't every team be like blobbity team? Well, you know what? They don't have any debt. Completely greenfield architecture, and they've been going, they've done it. So anyway, I'm just challenging, so you got me thinking about this advice about going deep, which is kind of a very interesting challenge that leaders have.
I don't see a conflict to this. And I think the first thing that you have to do in any way, and I don't mean just as a leader, like the company leader, it can also be a team leader, but whatever your size of unit is, because we also tend to, like, every team that I have ever spoken to has an opinion what's broken in a company. Everybody
Yeah.
seems to know what's broken in a company.
Everyone
That's
knows what
also
it is. It's
problematic.
apparently so clear to
Yeah.
everyone.
No,
Yeah.
it's so clear, right? Like, it's this founder, or like, yeah, it's how he ties his shoes in the morning. And I think, let me just say that there are some principles that I think everybody should do in order to have a chance, and that is to talk to pretty much everyone if you can, right? So, like, unless you have like 9,000 people employed or whatever, but like, you need to talk to everyone. You need to talk to your customers. You need to talk to your internal people. You need to talk especially to the departments that you don't want to talk to, which is usually HR, right? Like, nobody wants to talk to HR or whatever, but like, you still need to kind of have perspective to have a chance to make correct conclusions. And then in the end, what you should do anyways is not draw conclusions, as you said, but just try to make people better. And I'm strongly a believer of the servant leader kind of mindset, because my biggest achievements were on the backs, so to speak, of other people. I just
Mm,
hired great people who then made me extremely successful. So I'm actually more thinking about, hey, look, I have all this data now in my head, but instead of like drawing a conclusion, I'm just really going with good faith into a conversation and thinking like, so how can I make you now have a better day so you can actually lead better, and then probably, hopefully, also kind of pass this downwards. And ironically, this is also what you can do as a growth leader, or like as a growth advisor, in that sense, because even though I'm not the boss of anyone, usually people treat me like this when it comes to their
yeah.
acquisition flows. I think it's a bit hippie, but like, this is really how I believe to be a good leader. Like, you have to be available and you have to try to make people better. And yeah, it's not just coming down to how many people you actually have on your payroll. Like,
Right.
that's not the sum of your fame, I guess. No, we went super philosophical on this one,
Yeah,
John.
we got super philosophical. I need to go to work now. We should end it all philosophical and those things, but
Should people stay in contact with you? Should they contact you? How should they do this?
I don't look at Twitter much anymore, unfortunately. So I'm
Yeah,
very
I'm done
late
with
on
it.
any messages there. Yeah, I'm kind of laying low. Subscribe to the newsletter, reach out on LinkedIn if you have a problem that you need me to help with. That's
Good.
about it.
And we're just going to end it here. That's it. Thank you very much for this conversation, John. And
There we go.
I
Yeah,
see
my
you on the
pleasure.
next one.
Awesome.
Boom. Thank you so much for listening to The Product Tea with Leah. If you don't have enough yet, you can subscribe to my podcast right now on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, or you can head to my website, leahtarin.com, which is leahtarin.com, where you can find much more of my material or just want to work with me.